What's up, everybody? It's True Religion Man, aka Two Smoke, and the reason that I'm making this vlog is because I wanted to, speak to you guys about some of the things that are happening in Canada. Right now, I'm on tour in Asia, but there's an election happening, a federal election, and there's a lot of things that are going to affect us in our lifetime that we should really be taking into account and educating ourselves about. So I'm just going to break down some of the reasons why you really shouldn't vote for Stephen Harper or the Tory party and how they are basically selling your future. So let's just jump right into it. Stephen Harper and the Tories have actually planned to replace CPP with a new program called PRPP. What that is really is that the Canada Pension Plan, which has pretty much been in existence for the last 70, 80 years, it's a federal program, which means that the federal government makes sure that you don't get ripped off and that your savings is actually in a position that you can retire someday with it. Now, the new PRPP program that the Tories are trying to introduce would put that power in the hands of banks and insurance companies, and you all know what happened with the meltdown of the financial markets, and basically we're looking at a situation where in about 20, 30 years we won't be able to retire, we won't get a pension. We won't get a pension. And, when you're talking about little guys like this, my son, for example, I want him to be able to be in a position, where we still get some of the fundamental rights and benefits of being Canadian that our parents got. And it won't happen if the CPP is changed over to a private-based funding organization. Secondly, he's cut $1.2 billion from establishing a universal national child care. And he's given $1.4 billion to the oil companies instead. So basically, instead of having universal child care so that, single families and underprivileged children could have good child care that would be able to, help their parents out, he's chosen to give that money to probably the most wealthiest corporations in Canada. And, I think, there's countries like Germany and Denmark that have universal child care, and I think those countries should be models for us. I mean, at one time we were models for them, and, it's sad that at this point, we have probably some of the poorest child care and child care practices, especially for our low-income earning households. The third thing I want to talk about is education funding cuts. Canadian student debt is among some of the highest in the world. That means that for my generation, we graduate from universities and colleges literally probably $35,000 to $40,000 in debt, and it takes us 10 to 15 years to pay that off. Now, what that means is we're literally not going to be able to buy a house or invest in real estate or even start building and planning a life for ourselves until we're well into our 30s, because we'll be paying off this student debt. We'll be paying off student loans. And if you look at countries, again, in Europe that have taken the lead in some of these things, where university is 100% paid for by the government, those countries are continuing to develop and their economies are continuing to grow stronger with skilled labor. And the Tories have eliminated that. Also, they've eliminated huge amounts of the grants and scholarships that used to help some of the most underprivileged kids and families actually educate their children. Tuition is up all across the board. I mean, he's actually given cuts to the private schools and to private school students, while he's literally cut grants and scholarships while raising the price of tuition for university or post-secondary education. The fourth reason that I'm going to give you guys, and I want you guys to educate yourselves about, is simply this. He plans to increase prison spending by $5 billion a year, while closing rehabilitation and low to medium security prisons. What that means is he's basically building more jails for hardened criminals. Now, the Canadian crime rate has been dropping steadily since Jean Chrétien days. Since Jean Chrétien was in power and the Liberal Party was in power, it's been steadily falling. So why put $5 billion into more jails and less rehabilitation? We're talking about closing down the farms where inmates used to learn trades and educate themselves and become positive members of society, are being closed to create hardened individuals that are literally in jail for things as simple as driving without a license or possession of marijuana. And those people now aren't really being reintegrated into society. They're being hardened as criminals and it's even more difficult for them to actually come out and become progressive members of our society. And the fifth reason that I'm going to say is probably one of the biggest reasons not to vote for Stephen Harper and the Tories is the fact that he has pushed through Bill C-51. Now, what C-51 really is means that you as a Canadian citizen now, if they speculate that you or they think you might be a terrorist, and it's a very broad spectrum of what they can say as a terrorist. Basically, if you don't agree with them, at this point, they can spy on you, you can be held without a trial, and you can be handed over to a foreign agency without a trial, meaning they can hand you over to some form of torture in another country, and that's as a Canadian citizen. And these are things that basically have taken away our fundamental right to free trial. And you think, if you're going to tell me that it doesn't happen, here's another point. Canada's armed forces has handed over 6 times as many prisoners to be tortured. That's right, 6 times as many prisoners to be tortured as the British, and 20 times as many as the Dutch over the course of the war in Afghanistan and the war in Syria, war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq. He now is part of a coalition that's going into Syria and doing similar things. Another major point I want to make is the environmental reasons not to vote for Harper. One, if you have young children, this is going to come as a kind of a shock. He's actually put less regulations on pesticides to meet the US levels. Now what that means is in the US, they're allowed to have 100 times as much pesticide residue on your produce than the former Canadian laws, and he's reduced it, so now we're basically eating poison. Our kids are eating poison. He's poisoning our kids. You know, and corporate food producers now get to inspect their own products. There's no, government official looking over what you're eating. The actual corporations get to basically police themselves. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think that a corporation that's out to make money is going to necessarily look at your food and say, you know what, we're not going to sell it to you because there's too much pesticide in it. They're going to want to sell it because they're trying to make money. He's also cut $138 million for environmental research. We're at a tipping point in human evolution and human history where we're literally at a point, our environment is in danger. And without proper research, we're literally leaving no future for our children and our kids' kids. We're not going to have these beautiful beaches, and we're not going to have clean air to breathe and clean water to drink. There's also humanitarian issues that I want to discuss with you guys and educate you guys a little bit about. One, he refused to sign the UN Declaration designated clean water as a basic human right. What that means, right, is according to the Tory government and Stephen Harper, clean drinking water is not your right. You as a human being, wherever you are in the world, are not entitled to that. It's not a necessity of life. I want to see Stephen Harper not drink clean water for 2 months, and let's see what happens to him. He's cut foreign aid to the poorest countries by half since he's come into power, before freezing it completely in 2010. He's handed over 6 times as many prisoners, like I was saying earlier, to be tortured as Britain, and 20 times as many as the Dutch. Our soldiers and special forces are still dying, while American forces have already pulled out. And the reason you don't hear about that? Because there's a media ban on returning Canadian soldiers who have died in action. The PMO's office must approve any media coverage of those things. So they're not going to approve it because they know they're fucking up. They know, realistically speaking, our soldiers are dying, and they don't want you to know. They don't want you to know that your kid who enlisted in the army to defend Canada is dying so that people can steal oil in the Middle East. Another humanitarian issue is that he shut down women and minority groups. 43% funding dropped since 2006. And he's also shut down 12 of the 16 status of women offices already. That means women who are being abused, women who are maybe being sold into prostitution, etc. Their offices are being closed. And Canada was a leader in human and women's rights at one point, and now we're actually reversing that. In terms of our freedoms as Canadians, we all learned about the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in school. He's making changes to the Citizenship Act, which basically means that they can revoke your Canadian citizenship they can revoke the citizenship of your children at some point. There's gag orders on the media. There's changes to the electoral system, which basically means that now he can have a majority government with very few votes. He literally doesn't get the majority every time, but he can potentially get a majority government with only 39% of the vote. What I can suggest to everybody is educate yourself and educate your loved ones. And that's why the reason I'm making this particular video is because I want to make sure that Canadians, especially in my demographic, which is, you know, the 20 to 30, people who have actually are allowed to vote, can vote and are voting because they're educated. You know, there are some great potential leaders in this upcoming election. Me personally, I'll be voting for Justin Trudeau and the Liberal Party because I think their platform is very well done, and they have a lot of the things and ideas that the ideology of the Liberal Party that came into power with Justin Trudeau's father. I think with Justin Trudeau's father, what he did was he introduced a lot of the liberal ideas that made Canada, you know, the beacon of hope that it was for the entire world. And I'm happy to see that he's actually fulfilling his father's legacy, and I will be voting for Justin Trudeau. I think the most important thing, you know, if you're 15, 16, 17 years old and you can't vote yet, educate your parents. Show them this information. Make it so that they vote. Say no to Harper. You know, this is our kids' future. This is like, you know, the future of our country. So let's do it. Vote on October 19th. Yeah, so before I forget, since a lot of people are probably going to say, oh, he's not even in Canada, he's not going to vote. For anybody who's not in Canada, go to any Canada office, any Government of Canada office abroad, and you can get this. And you can actually get a ballot sent to you. I made it mandatory for all my staff at JTMG. I think if you're abroad, you know, you can still vote and make a difference. Make sure you vote. The most important thing, say no to Harper. Anybody but Harper. For our kids' future, for everybody's future, for Canada's future. You know? That's it.